Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1. I love hiking alone. The solitude, the clean mountain air, the feeling of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. It's peaceful. At least, that's what I used to believe. This happened in the Rocky Mountains, about 20 miles off any major trail. I had hiked all day and was setting up camp near a small, crystal clear river when I saw another hiker about 50 yards away. He was tall, maybe in his late 40s, with a scruffy beard and a red plaid jacket. The kind of guy you see in old survival magazines. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. His voice was friendly, but something about him felt off. I couldn't place it. Still, I nodded. Out here, you don't ignore people. His name was Greg, and he claimed he had been hiking this area for weeks. He said he loved the isolation, the way the mountains seemed to swallow you whole. We talked for hours, sitting by the fire. He told me stories, some about his life, others about strange things he'd seen out here. He spoke about hikers who had vanished, entire groups that walked into the woods and never came back. "You ever feel watched?" he asked suddenly. The fire cracked between us. "What?" He leaned forward, like something's watching you. Not a person, not an animal, something else. I shrugged, uneasy now. It's just the wilderness. It can mess with your head. Greg didn't respond. He just stared into the fire, his face flickering with the flames. We turned in for the night. I crawled into my tent, zipping myself in tight, listening to the wind howl through the trees. Then I woke up, rustling. It was close, right outside my tent. I froze, my mind racing. Probably Greg, I thought, just getting up to take a leak or check the fire. "Greg?" I whispered. No answer. I waited. The wind had died down. The forest was too silent. I reached for my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and pointed the beam toward Greg's tent. It was wide open. His sleeping bag was inside, still unzipped, like he had just stepped out. His boots were still there, his backpack untouched. But Greg was gone. I crawled out, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. "Greg?" I tried again, louder this time. The trees didn't answer. Something about it sent a deep, primal fear through me. There were no footprints in the dirt around his tent. No sign of struggle. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. I spent the next hour searching. I went toward the river, calling his name. I climbed up a rocky ledge for a better vantage point. Nothing. By dawn, I was exhausted, scared, and ready to get the hell out of there. I packed up, my hands shaking, my skin ice cold. Before I left, I stopped by Greg's tent one last time. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd find something I missed. And I did. His jacket was still inside. That red plaid jacket. The one he had been wearing the night before. I ran. I hiked faster than I ever had before, covering miles in what felt like minutes. By midday, I reached the ranger station, breathless and desperate. "There was a man," I said. His name was Greg. "He went missing last night." The ranger, an older guy with tired eyes, frowned. "No one else is registered to be in that section of the park," he said. I shook my head. No, he was there. We camped together. He had a red plaid jacket. The ranger's face changed. His expression tightened. A red plaid jacket, he repeated slowly. Yes, please, we need to find him. The ranger sighed, rubbing his temples. Then he walked over to a filing cabinet, pulled out a faded, yellowed folder, and handed it to me. I opened it. Inside was a missing persons report. Gregory Fields. Last seen 1982. Disappeared while hiking in the exact same spot where I met him. The photo attached? A man with a scruffy beard, wearing a red plaid jacket. I stared at the ranger, my mouth dry. He sighed. We hear stories like yours every few years. I swallowed hard. What stories? Some hikers say they meet Greg, talk with him, camp with him. Then, by morning, he's gone. But we haven't had anyone by that name registered in decades. I felt sick. What happens to them? I asked. The ranger's face darkened. Some just leave and never come back. Others, well, we find their campsites. Sometimes they're packs. But we never find them. I drove home that day, but the mountains have never left me. Because sometimes late at night, I still hear his voice, asking me if I ever feel watched. Story 2. We weren't supposed to be there. That's what kept running through my mind as we stood outside the old ranger station. Its windows shattered, its walls warped from years of harsh winters and isolation. The place looked like something nature had chewed up and spit out. I remember Chris laughing, his voice echoing in the empty forest. Dude, this is straight out of a horror movie, he said, kicking an old sign that lay half buried in the dirt. You sure this place is abandoned? Since the 70s, Mark replied, brushing dust off a weathered plaque nailed to the front door. Some kind of accident. A ranger went missing. They never found him. I didn't like how he said it. Like it was just a fact, nothing more. But even facts can unsettle you when the sun starts dipping behind the trees, stretching shadows long and thin. Still, we went inside. The place smelled of rot and damp wood. The floor creaked under our weight. Old furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs, sat untouched. Papers were scattered across a desk, some so faded they were nothing but ghosts of words. Then there was the radio. It sat on a shelf near the back, covered in grime. Just as we turned to leave, it crackled to life. Static. Just a burst of sound before cutting off. Okay, nope, I said, backing toward the door. Nope. The others laughed, but there was nervous energy behind it. None of us were dumb enough to ignore the way the hair on our arms had risen, or how suddenly the woods outside seemed too quiet. We left. That night, after a long hike back to our campsite, we settled into our tents. The fire had burned low, casting weak orange light against the trees. Mark and Chris were out within minutes, but I lay awake, listening to the wind sigh through the branches. Then I heard it, my name, soft but unmistakable. Jason. I held my breath. It had come from outside the tent. A trick of the wind, I told myself. I had to believe that. Then it spoke again. Jason, come outside. I went cold. It wasn't just my name. It was my voice. The exact tone, the exact inflection. It sounded just like me. I stared at the ceiling of my tent, my heart hammering. The fire outside was still flickering, casting shifting shadows. I told myself not to move, not to look, but I did. I unzipped the flap an inch and peeked out, and I saw myself standing just beyond the firelight. Same height, same build, same hoodie, jeans, and boots. Its head was tilted slightly, like it was studying me. My stomach twisted. My mouth went dry. The thing smiled. I slammed my eyes shut. I don't know why, but I did, like a kid pulling the covers over his head. I started whispering a prayer I hadn't said in years. I don't even know if I finished it before exhaustion dragged me into an uneasy sleep. By morning, I almost convinced myself it had been a dream. Then we saw the campsite. Everything was moved, not stolen, not trashed, just rearranged. Chris's sleeping bag was unzipped and inside out. Mark's boots were sitting neatly by the fire pit, pointed toward the woods. Our food, our backpacks, even our water bottles had been carefully shifted. But my stuff was in the exact same place, untouched, like whatever had been here had only been interested in me. We packed up fast. As we left, I glanced back at the trees. The morning light had burned away the shadows, but I still felt them watching. I never went back, never told the others what I saw. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I'll hear it again. A whisper. Jason, come outside. Story 3. I don't believe in ghosts. Or at least, I didn't before Glacier National Park. The trip was supposed to be a way to clear my head. Work had been hell, my personal life even worse, and I thought a solo hiking trip would help me reset. Just me, nature, and the simple rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other. I was about 4 days in, deep in the backcountry, when I first saw him. The trail was quiet, nothing but the crunch of my boots and the occasional rustling of trees in the wind. It was late afternoon, the kind of golden light that makes everything look like an old photograph. I rounded a bend, and there he was, standing completely still in the middle of the trail. At first, I thought he was a park ranger. He wore an old-fashioned uniform, the kind I'd seen in historical photos. The fabric was sun-bleached, the edges frayed. His boots were scuffed and caked in mud. His hat sat low over his forehead, casting a shadow over his face. I lifted a hand. Hey there. No response. Something about him made my skin prickle. Maybe it was the way he stood, too stiff, too still. I tried again. Everything okay? Nothing. A knot of unease twisted in my stomach. But I told myself I was being ridiculous. He was probably just some old-timer, hard of hearing. I took a step closer, and that's when he moved, not the way a person moves. His head snapped toward me in a single, jerky motion, like a puppet on a string. And his face, there was nothing there. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over bone. I sucked in a breath, stumbling backward. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. The thing tilted its head like a curious dog, and then it started to glide toward me. Not walk, glide. Its legs didn't move. The boots scraped against the dirt like dead weight as it drifted forward, silent as a shadow. I ran. I don't remember making the decision, don't even remember turning around. 1 second I was frozen, the next I was sprinting down the trail, lungs burning, trees blurring past me. I didn't stop until I reached my campsite. My hands shook as I fumbled with my pack, my tent, my gear, anything to ground myself, to make this place feel real again. Night fell slow and heavy. I sat by my small fire, gripping my pocket knife, ears straining for the sound of movement in the dark. But the forest was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no wind, not even the rustle of branches. At some point, exhaustion took over. I crawled into my sleeping bag, every nerve in my body still buzzing with leftover fear. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up to the sound of something breathing outside my tent. It was slow, deep, ragged. I held my breath. The fabric of the tent rippled, as if someone was pressing their hand against it. A shadow fell over me, long, thin, too tall. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. The breathing moved, circling, listening. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was trapped, paralyzed by the kind of fear that digs into your bones and roots you in place. The zipper of my tent twitched, just a fraction of an inch. Then, silence. The shadow disappeared. The presence outside my tent was gone. I don't know how long I lay there, wide-eyed and shaking. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the tent walls, and I forced myself to move. The moment I unzipped the tent, my stomach dropped. Boot prints, dozens of them, circling my tent. I packed up in record time and hiked back towards civilization, heart hammering the entire way. I didn't stop, didn't look back. When I reached the ranger station, I told them everything. The man on duty listened, nodding slowly. When I finished, he didn't laugh, didn't dismiss me as some paranoid hiker. Instead, his face went pale. "We don't talk about that out here," he said. Then he turned away, like the conversation was over, like it had never happened. And I knew, right then, that I wasn't the first person to see the man with no face. And I wouldn't be the last. Story 4. Denali National Park is a place where the silence stretches long and deep. It's the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you know logically you're alone. That's what drew me and my friend Eric out there in the first place. We were both seasoned campers, used to roughing it in the wild. No cell service, no distractions. Just miles of untouched land, whispering pines, and a sky so dark at night that it felt like you could fall right into it. We wanted the isolation, the stillness. We got more than we bargained for. The first night passed without much incident. We set up camp beside a narrow creek, the water babbling softly as we built a fire and cooked up some canned chili. The wind rustled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out. The second night was different. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching against the damp forest floor just outside the tent. At first, I thought it was a bear. My heart started hammering, but I stayed still, listening. The steps weren't heavy enough for a bear. Too light, too human. I turned my head toward Eric's sleeping bag. He was snoring softly, completely unaware. Carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moon was bright, casting long shadows through the trees. That's when I saw the footprints, bare feet, deep in the mud, leading up to our tent. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. My first thought was that maybe another camper had wandered into our sight. But the more I looked, the more something felt wrong. There were no footprints leading away. Whoever had walked up to our tent had never left. A chill settled into my bones as I scanned the woods. Nothing, just empty trees swaying in the wind. I swallowed hard and backed into the tent, zipping it up quickly. My breathing felt too loud. My heartbeat, a drum against my ribs. I shook Eric's shoulder. "Wake up, man. Something's not right." He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Dude, what?" I motioned for him to be quiet and pointed toward the footprints. His face scrunched in confusion, then slowly shifted to something closer to fear. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped outside. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for late summer. Our breaths came out in small clouds as we followed the footprints. They led straight into the middle of a clearing, and then just stopped. No more prints. No sign of someone stepping backward. No indication of where they'd gone. It was like whoever made them had just vanished into thin air. Eric exhaled sharply. Maybe they, I don't know, jumped? Jumped where? I asked. They'd have to be some kind of Olympic athlete. He had no answer. Neither did I. The feeling of being watched was thick now, almost suffocating. The trees loomed taller, darker, like they were leaning in. I shined my flashlight around the clearing. Nothing. Just the footprints and the vast, yawning silence. We backed away, returning to our tent with quick, nervous steps. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake listening. At some point, maybe around 3 or 4 in the morning, I heard it again. A voice. A whisper. Right outside the tent. I couldn't make out the words. It was low, soft, threading through the fabric like a needle. I held my breath. Then, something touched the tent. A dragging sound like fingers running over the fabric. I wanted to move, to wake Eric, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My muscles locked, frozen in place. The whispering stopped. The air grew heavy. My chest ached from holding my breath. Then a new sound, a single footprint in the mud. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted upright and ripped open the tent flap. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The trees stood silent. The moon stared down like a blind eye. But there was one new thing. A single bare footprint right in front of the tent, facing the opposite way, like someone had been standing there, watching us while we slept. Eric and I didn't talk much the next morning. We packed up quickly, neither of us wanting to admit how shaken we were. As we hiked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, and somewhere, just beyond the trees, I swear I saw someone standing there, just watching. We never went back. Story 5. I don't scare easy. I've spent nights alone in the woods before, listening to the rustling of animals just outside my tent, the wind pushing through the trees like an invisible hand. You get used to it after a while. The dark stops being so dark. The silence stops being so silent. But Yosemite was different. I should have turned back the moment I set foot on that trail. It was late September, just past peak tourist season, so I figured I'd get a few days of solitude in before the cold set in. I hiked about 10 miles off the main trail, deep enough that I wouldn't see another soul, but not so far that I couldn't make it back in a hurry if I needed to. I had my pack, my tin, a rifle in case of bears. Everything I needed. The first night was peaceful. The air was crisp, the trees whispering above me, the sky so clear I could see every single star. I made a small fire, heated up some canned chili, read a few chapters of a book before crawling into my sleeping bag. I don't know what woke me. Maybe the wind, maybe something else. I lay there, eyes open, body frozen. The kind of stillness that comes when your instincts tell you something is off. There was a sound outside, faint, almost like breathing. I sat up slowly and reached for my flashlight. The tent fabric glowed dimly as I switched it on, the beam cutting through the small mesh window. Nothing. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting everything in a dull orange glow. The trees stood still. No wind, no rustling, just the sound of my own breathing. I almost convinced myself it was nothing. Almost. But then I saw it. A figure, barely visible between the trees. Standing there, watching. I snapped my head back inside and zipped the tent shut, heart hammering against my ribs. It was just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. Just the way the firelight flickered against the trunks. Nothing was there. Hadn't I been in the woods 100 times before? I lay back down, staring at the ceiling of the tent, waiting for sleep to come. It didn't. By morning, the fear felt foolish. The daylight made everything ordinary again. I packed up my gear, hiked further up the ridge, and found a new spot to camp. A little higher, a little more open. Nothing to block my line of sight. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood, setting up camp. By the time the sun started dipping below the trees, I was feeling like myself again. Then, as I was boiling water for coffee, I saw it again. Closer this time, a figure half hidden behind a tree, just standing there. I froze, gripping the metal handle of my pot. The fire popped, sending a spray of embers into the air. And for the briefest moment, the figure was illuminated. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs were twisted in a way that wasn't right. The head was cocked too far to one side, like its neck was broken. I blinked, and it was gone. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe exhaustion was messing with me. Still, I kept my rifle close that night. Every single noise outside made me jump. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. At one point, I swear I heard something moving just beyond the edge of my camp. Not an animal, something bigger. Slow, deliberate steps. I didn't dare look. By dawn, my nerves were shot. My gut told me to leave, and for once, I didn't argue. I packed up faster than I ever had before. Every so often, I'd glance back at the trees, expecting to see it. But I didn't. Not until I was nearly off the ridge. I was about to descend the final stretch when I stopped. Something told me to turn around, and there it was, standing at the top of the ridge, watching me. In the daylight, I could see it clearly for the first time. Its skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too tight over bones that looked human, but weren't. The arms were too long, the fingers too thin. Its head was cocked at that same impossible angle. But the worst part, I could feel it grinning at me. I couldn't see a mouth. I don't even know how I knew it was smiling. But I did. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I threw my gear in the back, peeled out of there so fast my tires kicked up a cloud of dust. Even now, I feel it sometimes. like something still has its eyes on me, like something followed me home. Story 6. We saw him just after noon, walking ahead of us on the trail. The sun was high, the heat pressing down like an iron hand. We'd been hiking since morning, 5 of us, all friends from college. The Shenandoah National Park stretched around us in a vast, quiet sprawl of green and brown. Birds called from the treetops. The dirt path crunched beneath our boots. Everything was normal, peaceful. Then we saw the man. He was maybe 50 yards ahead, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. His clothes struck me first. Not the synthetic, modern gear you'd expect on a hiker, but old-fashioned wool trousers, a button-up shirt, and a canvas rucksack slung over his back. He looked like something out of an old black and white hiking guide, the kind our grandfathers might have read. "Hey," Dave, the loudest in our group, called out. "Nice day for a walk, huh?" No response. The man kept walking, his head slightly down, as if he hadn't heard. Maybe he had earbuds in, I thought, but that didn't make sense. He didn't have the usual hiker's gear. No water bottle, no modern backpack, nothing. We sped up a little, trying to close the gap, but somehow, no matter how fast we walked, he stayed exactly the same distance ahead. 50 yards. Always 50 yards. "Creepy old dude," Sarah muttered. "Maybe he's lost. Maybe he's a ghost," Ben joked. But his laugh was nervous. For the next hour, we followed him. Every bend, every hill, every clearing, he was always there, moving at that same steady pace. We started calling him the pacemaker. The more I watched, the more something felt wrong. His stride never changed. His arms never swung. He just walked like a wind-up toy wound too tightly, set loose on the trail. A little after 2 p.m., we lost sight of him. It was a bend in the trail, a sharp curve with thick trees on both sides. We turned the corner, and he was gone. We stopped looking around. The forest was silent, heavy with summer stillness. There were no side trails, no place he could have gone. Just the path stretching ahead, empty now. "No way," Dave said. "No freaking way. Maybe he stepped off the trail," Sarah suggested, scanning the tree line. "Bathroom break." But there was no rustling, no movement, no sound at all. Then we reached the ridge. A wooden sign stood at the edge of the overlook, weathered and faded, but still legible. I stepped forward to read it. It was a memorial, a list of hikers who had gone missing in the park over the past century. Names carved into the wood, worn smooth by time and weather. My stomach clenched as my eyes scanned the names. And then I saw it. Alan D. Wright. Missing August 1954. Last seen wearing a tan button-up shirt and canvas hiking gear. I felt like the air had been knocked out of my chest. "Guys," my voice came out thin, strangled. "Look at this." One by one, they leaned in, reading. No one spoke. No one moved. "It's just a coincidence," Dave whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. Ben was the first to back away. "We need to go back. Now." We turned. The trees pressed close around us, the sunlight suddenly weaker, as if a storm were rolling in. We started walking fast, then jogging, then running. No one spoke, no one joked. There was only the sound of our breath, the pounding of our feet, and the overwhelming sense that we were being followed. I don't know how, but I swear I heard footsteps behind us. Steady, measured, unhurried, 50 yards back. We didn't stop until we reached the ranger station, breathless and pale-faced. When we told the ranger what we had seen, he just looked at us for a long moment. Then he nodded, as if he had heard it before. "People see him sometimes," he said quietly. "Always on that trail. Always 50 yards ahead. But why?" Sarah asked. The ranger shook his head. "Maybe he's still walking, still trying to find his way home." We left the park that evening. None of us spoke much on the drive back. The next time we went hiking, it was somewhere else. I still think about him. The man with the old canvas rucksack and the steady, endless walk. And sometimes late at night, when I close my eyes, I hear footsteps. 50 yards back. Always 50 yards back. Story 7. The cave didn't have a name. At least, not one that we knew of. It wasn't marked on the park maps, and no signs warned hikers to stay away. Just a dark, yawning mouth carved into the side of the canyon wall, half hidden behind a tangle of sagebrush and deadfall. My friend Kevin was the first to spot it. "That's not on the map," he said, stepping closer. "Maybe there's a reason for that," I muttered, wiping sweat from my brow. It was mid-afternoon, the desert heat pressing down on us like a lead weight. We'd been hiking the back trails of the Grand Canyon for most of the day, looking for a shaded spot to rest before heading back to camp. This cave seemed perfect, cool, dark, and inviting in the worst kind of way. Kevin grinned and pulled out his flashlight. "Come on," he said. "Just a quick look." I should have said no. I should have turned around right then and there. Instead, I followed him inside. The temperature dropped immediately, like we had stepped into a different world. The air smelled old, stale, like damp stone and something else I couldn't quite place. The walls were smooth at first, carved by time and water, but as we moved deeper, the texture changed. Strange grooves and ridges, almost like scratches, lined the stone. "Natural erosion?" I asked, running my fingers over the marks. Kevin didn't answer. He was shining his light ahead, deeper into the cave. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I listened. A low murmur, barely more than a breath, floated through the tunnel. I told myself it was the wind, but there was no wind in the cave. We walked further in, our footsteps crunching on loose rock. The murmurs grew louder. Words, maybe. The cadence was human, but the language was just beyond understanding, like a half-heard conversation in a crowded room. Kevin stopped so suddenly I almost ran into him. "Jesus," he breathed. His flashlight beam landed on something ahead. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, but then my stomach twisted. Handprints. Hundreds of them. Some big, some small, stamped into the stone like fossils. But these weren't painted. They weren't etched. They looked pressed into the rock, as if the stone had been soft when they touched it. A new whisper drifted through the air. Closer this time, right next to my ear. "Turn back." The words weren't clear, not spoken aloud, but I heard them just the same. I grabbed Kevin's arm. "We should go." "Yeah," he said. His voice was shaking. We turned to leave, but something changed. The tunnel we had come through, it wasn't there anymore. The walls had shifted, closing in, twisting into a different shape. The entrance was gone. My breath hitched. Kevin swung his flashlight in frantic arcs. The beam flickered, dimming like the batteries were dying. Then I saw them, not shadows, figures, dozens of them, standing just beyond the reach of the light. Not moving, not breathing, just watching. Kevin swore and grabbed my arm, pulling me forward. We ran. The walls closed in, forcing us down a winding, claustrophobic tunnel. My lungs burned, my pulse hammering in my ears. The whispers grew into a chorus, hundreds of voices overlapping, pressing into my skull like fingers digging into my brain. I stumbled, and something brushed against my leg. Not a rock, not a root, a hand. I screamed and kicked at it, scrambling forward. The air thickened like wading through water. The tunnel walls shuddered, groaning like something ancient and alive. Then, out of nowhere light, a crack in the darkness. Kevin reached it first, shoving himself through. I lunged after him, the stone walls grasping at my skin, fingers of rock trying to pull me back. Then, I was out, flat on my stomach, gasping for air, the heat of the desert sun stabbing into my back like knives. The cave was behind us, the entrance wide open, dark and silent. It looked different, like nothing had ever changed, like the walls had never shifted, like nothing had chased us. Kevin was pale, sweat dripping down his face. What the hell was that? He choked. I didn't have an answer. We ran until we reached the main trail. A mile later, we found an old man sitting outside a dusty shack near the ranger station. He eyed us as we approached, then shook his head. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," he said. Kevin and I exchanged a look. I hesitated. "We found a cave." The old man's expression hardened. "A cave?" "Yeah," Kevin said. "Up near the ridge. The one with—" He stopped himself. The old man's eyes darkened. "That cave was sealed off 30 years ago." His voice was flat. "That's not possible," I said. Park officials blocked it." The man interrupted. "Because people went in and didn't come back." My stomach turned. He looked at us long and hard, then spat into the dirt. "If I were you," he said, "I'd forget you ever found it." I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls against my window, I still hear the whispers. Story 8. I don't scare easy. I've hiked alone for years, from the dense forests of Oregon to the jagged cliffs of the Rockies. There's something about the solitude, the quiet, the way the trees whisper in the wind. It makes me feel small, but in a good way. Puts things into perspective. But what happened in the Great Smoky Mountains, well, that's a different story. I've been on the trail since dawn, weaving my way through towering oaks and thick underbrush. The sun had started its slow descent when I found a clearing, a perfect spot to rest. I dropped my pack, took a swig from my water bottle, and let the silence settle around me. That's when I saw him, a park ranger, standing just at the tree line. At first glance, nothing seemed strange. He was tall, lean, wearing the standard uniform, khaki shirt, forest green pants, that wide-brimmed hat. But something about him was off. His uniform looked old, not just worn, but outdated, like something from another era. His boots were caked in mud, his skin unnaturally pale, almost grayish under the fading light. He didn't walk toward me. He just stood there, watching. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. The kind of tone that makes your stomach knot up before your brain even understands why. I forced a chuckle. I've been hiking alone for years. I'll be fine. The ranger shook his head. It's getting dark. I glanced at the sky. The sun was still clinging to the horizon, spilling streaks of orange and pink across the clouds. I had at least another hour before darkness set in. I'll be setting up camp soon, I said. Thanks for checking in, though. He didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge my words at all. He just turned and walked away, back into the trees, moving with a strange, stiff gait, like his joints didn't bend quite right. I don't know why, but my skin prickled as he disappeared into the forest. I didn't stay in that clearing much longer. I picked up my pack and moved further down the trail, wanting to put some distance between myself and whatever uneasy feeling had settled in my gut. By the time I reached the visitor center that night, I'd all but convinced myself that I'd overreacted. Maybe he was just an odd guy. Maybe I was just tired. The woman behind the desk greeted me with a smile as I stepped inside. Long hike? She asked. Yeah, I said. Beautiful trails out there. She nodded, tapping something into her computer. Glad you're enjoying it. Anything I can help you with? I hesitated. The logical part of my brain told me to drop it, but the rest of me, the part still crawling with unease, needed to ask. Yeah, actually, I ran into a ranger earlier today. Didn't catch his name. Tall guy, really pale, kind of old-fashioned uniform. The woman's smile faltered. We don't have any rangers out on that trail today, she said. I frowned. Are you sure? He was just out past the oak clearing. She stared at me for a long moment. Then, almost reluctantly, she reached under the counter and pulled out a faded black and white photograph. Was it him? She asked, sliding it across the counter. My breath caught in my throat. It was him. The same sharp cheekbones, the same narrow eyes, the same stiff posture, even the same uniform. Only the photo looked like it was decades old. I looked up at her. Yeah, that's him. The woman swallowed hard, lowering her voice. That ranger died on duty 30 years ago. I felt the blood drain from my face. That's not possible. He spoke to me. She nodded slowly. People have reported seeing him before. Always at dusk. Always with the same warning. A chill ran down my spine. What happened to him? She hesitated, then sighed. He went out on patrol one evening and never came back. They found his body weeks later, deep in the forest. No one knows what happened to him. No animal marks. No signs of struggle. Just dead. My stomach churned. So why do people keep seeing him? She shook her head. I don't know, but they all say the same thing. My throat felt tight. What's that? Her eyes met mine, dark and serious. If you ignore his warning, you don't come back. The air around me seemed heavier. The quiet hum of the visitor center suddenly suffocating. My mind raced, replaying my encounter. The pale skin, the vacant expression, the way he moved, like he wasn't entirely human anymore. And his warning, I'd brushed it off, thinking I knew better, thinking I was just another hiker with a strong will and a sturdy pack. But now, I wasn't so sure. I didn't sleep that night, and in the morning, I packed my things and left the park without looking back. Some things aren't meant to be questioned. Some warnings aren't meant to be ignored. And some rangers, it seems, never really leave their post.